I am very excited that in this particular session, we have Dr. Jody Quas from UCI. Every time she does another study, I'm excited, and I interviewed her about her most recent research, which inspired us to call this plenary Talking to Youth Who Have Been Exploited. So we have Dr. Jody Quas, who is the research expert, and then Dr. Lenora Burney and Alyssa Vergara from Healthcare Agency, who are actually the on-the-ground practitioners talking to youth who have been exploited. Their bios are in the Sketch app, and so I'm going to let them take the time now, so we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Okay, so this is also the international sign for next slide, in case anybody wonders why I do this periodically. So thank you very much. My name is Jody Quas, and I am a developmental psychologist at UC Irvine. And so I always start out my talks with kind of a little bit of humility here. I'm the scientists. They're the really important people. You all are the really important people. You're on the front lines. So just kind of humor me and let me go on and talk to you a little bit about science, and then you can listen to the people who are actually really having these direct impacts. So what I wanted to talk to you today is, we called this session Talking to Adolescents About Exploitation or Victimization. But I want to pan back for just a moment and kind of pan back and talk about, over the past 25 years, there has been this enormous increase in awareness of commercial sexual exploitation, particularly of children and youth. And so, when you look at this explosion of awareness, what you'll see, we know it's a global problem, but it's also a national problem, it's a state problem, and it's a local problem. So there have now been multiple talks today talking about, at all these different levels, the different ways that youth may be exploited across these domains. So there's really been an effort to increase everyone's awareness of all of these types of exploitation and all the ways that it can occur. And so you'll see this. I worked with Homeland Security. They have a Blue campaign. You see these See Something, Say Something campaigns. There was the task force formed by the federal government to really try to target and kind of some of the domains where we can increase awareness. And so when you look at these awareness, these kind of public awareness campaigns, you'll oftentimes see signs like this. So anybody who takes the bus anywhere or travels somewhere by an airport, you'll see kind of these, I have to think about this. Yes, you're left. So you'll see these types of advertisements. I actually took a couple pictures of these while I was at the airport. And so you'll see these kinds of awareness campaigns. And then anytime you can talk about Liam Neeson in a talk, I think you should bring that up as well. So many people saw that movie. And again, the idea was, we're really increasing everyone's knowledge about this problem that's occurring, sometimes what we think is in plain sight. But my question for you is, do the victims really look like this? And in a way, I'm preaching to the choir here, because you all know the answer, right? So when you look at victims' history, number one, they have these enormous kind of histories of adversity exposure, maltreatment, homelessness, living in foster care. So they have these kind of multiple adversities. Many are undocumented. You also have increases in minoritized racial or ethnic groups, LGBTQ groups. Many of them, the first time they're exploited, are also in adolescence. And I really harp a lot on just adolescent developmental processes, kind of some of the characteristics that are normative in adolescence, like they don't like making eye contact. They don't like talking to adults as much. Those are all normative characteristics that you don't see oftentimes in the images of the public interest campaigns. They're fairly mistrusting of authorities. That mistrust may be well-founded. They've had entire histories of interfacing with different types of authorities, and whether it was for their own good or not, oftentimes that led to very significant and sometimes very distressing outcomes. And finally, finally, many of them have this repeated contact with the authorities as delinquents. So again, they really don't look like those images. So when we think about identification and intervening on behalf of vulnerable youth, I kind of want to step back and I always want to say, well, recognition. Before we can intervene, before we can identify youth, we need to recognize who those high-risk youth are. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight to you some of the ways that we've been trying to figure out, well, how do people recognize this? Again, not you in this room, but you're not the only people out there interfacing with these youth. So what I wanted to do is I want to start out with this, who are the professionals who encounter youth? I mean, I've already mentioned social services and law enforcement, and certainly they do, but there's other really important professionals who interface with high-risk youth quite frequently. So I have up here healthcare providers. There's actually surveys, retrospective surveys of former victims. About 60 to 80, 90% of them report having encountered or sort of interacted with healthcare professionals while being exploited. So there's an interesting opportunity. In addition to healthcare providers, school professionals. There's also retrospective studies of exploited adolescents who report that they're recruited and they learn about exploitation by peers at school. And we're talking about different forms of exploitation, but think about sharing social media apps in this day and age. Think about the $50 feet pics that your friend's selling that you can too. So you can learn a heck of a lot at school from your peers. In addition, and again, in these retrospective surveys, survivors are reporting that they're attending school while being exploited, and a sizable number of them say not only are they attending school, they're doing pretty well. They're passing their classes. And so what's really interesting about both of those groups, and I don't know if you saw that on the bottom, is that both of these groups, if you look at surveys of just how much you trust different professionals, children, adolescents, adults, high risk, low risk, everyone trusts professionals in healthcare and school far more than they trust law enforcement and social service. That's no disrespect to law enforcement or social service. This is just who people trust, which means to whom might they disclose. So here are these enormous opportunities where we can be talking to different professionals, and these professionals may be interfacing with high-risk youth. And so these professionals may have this fantastic opportunity to identify and intervene. But in order to do that, they need to recognize this. Okay. So we've actually done a lot of work to look at how well these professionals recognize these high-risk youth. So in one of the studies that I conducted, and let me do like a couple of just call-outs with my doctoral student, Katie Winks, along with Corey Rude, and even Lisa Murdoch, who is a nurse practitioner, has been involved in some of these. But they've been enormously helpful in these surveys. But we've actually just been asking EMTs, firefighters, emergency room nurses, physicians, clinic workers about their knowledge of high-risk youth and potential risk for exploitation. So we give them vignettes, we give them scenarios based on ones that are actually occurring as reported by former survivors. So survivors will tell us how they interacted with, and encountered these different healthcare professionals. We'll give these scenarios to healthcare professionals. We don't say, here's an exploited youth. We just give them the scenario, because when professionals encounter youth in the environment, the youth don't have a t-shirt that says I'm exploited. They're in these fast in these high-risk situations. These professionals need to evaluate situations quickly. They need to determine kind of best plans of action. So we kind of presented these scenarios, and then we ask them about what they think. We're like, so what's going on here? Tell me what's happening. What should you do? And then we also just surveyed them after that. We did survey them just about their general knowledge of adolescent development. Do they really understand adolescent development? Do they understand kind of risk for trafficking? Do they understand interviewing? And I'll get to that in a moment, why that's important. Okay, So just briefly, here's a little bit about what we found from our healthcare survey. So great news. They all recognize high-risk situations. And they should, right? So they recognize that these high-risk situations are going beyond just the immediate medical needs. But when you look at their actual recognition of kind of potential risk for trafficking or exploitation, you see these numbers drop enormously. Nurses kind of in clinics are a little better than EMTs. They also, though, good news, they do recognize this need that somebody needs to collect more information. You know, more nurses kind of and emergency room physicians than EMTs. But what's really important is 30% of the EMTs said, you know, yes, somebody does need to collect more information, but it's not my responsibility. Now, we can have a discussion about whose responsibility it is, and I'm not arguing they're wrong. But what it does suggest is they're recognizing some risk, but they don't have the capacity, and they don't really know and have kind of the knowledge of, okay, well, if it's not my responsibility, whose is it, and can I direct that? Okay, so to kind of summarize this, healthcare professionals, they recognize risk, good, but not risk for trafficking, challenging, right? I don't want to say bad. And some of these professionals, mostly in the field, don't see it as their responsibility to respond further. You know, their responsibility is that immediate medical need. So that was sort of one study. And then we followed this up. We're like, well, what about school professionals? It's another group that is interfacing with these high-risk youth quite regularly. What do they know? So what we did with our school professionals is we did another kind of one of these surveys. We had almost 400 of these respondents, and we targeted states in the southern states, California, Texas, and Florida, states where you might have higher rates of risk. And we gave them these vignettes, and again, these are vignettes based on actual survivors' descriptions of sort of their interactions with school professionals. And by school professionals, we targeted school counselors, school nurses, and then other school administrators who interface with youth about health and well-being. And so we gave them these vignettes of high-risk kind of situations, and we asked, how would you proceed? What would you ask of the student? How and when, where? And then what we did is we went into these kind of narrative responses, and we kind of reviewed their answers to say, okay, well, again, do they recognize risk? And then do they recognize trafficking? And then what would they do? Like, do they have kind of a plan in place? Okay, so here is a graph of our findings. So we gave them a couple of different vignettes. And so the blue on the bottom shows whether they recognize the different types of risk in one vignette. The yellow shows two vignettes. Gray means they didn't say it at all. Okay? Yellow's good. So everybody just look at the graphs, yellow's good. So on the farthest left, what you see is school professionals, they get it. And again, they're knowledgeable, they understand high-risk youth, so they do understand that these scenarios are describing high-risk youth. Now, larger numbers of the school professionals than the healthcare professionals also recognized risk for exploitation. In addition to exploitation, quite a few of them picked up risk of sexual activity, risk of child abuse, risk of child sex abuse. A small number said prostitution or delinquent behavior. So if you kind of collapse across that and you go, okay, who all recognizes potential sex? We're actually doing a little better. And these are professionals who interact with adolescents all the time. And so, good news again is that they do have some level of knowledge. When we then ask them, well, what are you going to do? What should you do? Most of these professionals as well really saw it as their responsibility to follow up. So they do recognize that there's risk. They might not recognize the precise type of risk, but the value is here. They are recognizing the need to follow up directly with the student. They talked about kind of the need to kind of build a relationship, to check on safety, to kind of ask the youth what's going on, to really find out from the youth about the youth's needs, and what's happening. So kind of, there's lots of other findings. If you want, we can spend days on that because I love that. But kind of bottom line, what we really thought about is, school-based professionals, they do recognize risk, even though, again, like few are explicitly saying exploitation, they're a little better in sort of this vulnerable kind of domain of sexual activity. And they also kind of recognize the need to follow up, and that they probably should. They also see value in maintaining this contact with the youth, again, that they would follow up. So when we kind of pan back and we think about these kinds of data together, what we're really pushing right now is, number one, that we really need to change the training of professionals. That we can't keep putting up the same posters. I don't know if anybody saw the posters for nurses, but again, it has the woman in the chains. That most women don't show up at a clinic in chains. So what we really need to do is change how we're training professionals, namely the professionals who are both likely to encounter those victims, but also who are in really valuable positions of trust. Because if we don't train these people, it's an enormous missed opportunity. So we need to train them correctly on the types of situations that they're most likely to encounter. So that's really what we're doing in a lot of my lab with my team now, is really thinking about how do you do these kinds of training? How do you get in front of not the people here who get it, but the first responders who are out there on a daily basis going out to do their job and do the best they can. In addition, though, this training kind of, number one, the training needs to focus on actual predictors of risks, but also these trainings need to kind of help professionals develop clear action plans. And really this idea has come from our healthcare survey, where you see a lot of these EMTs say, that's not my responsibility. So if you're going to ask and find out something, what do you do with it? If they have no action plan in place and they have no idea how to respond, it's not fair to put that burden on them without giving them the tools as well. So just training on CSEC, risk, just training on characteristics, it's not enough though. So I'm going to go back to my kind of 25 years of expertise, which is really on how do you interview children and adolescents about high-risk topics and high-risk behaviors and negative experiences, including trauma. And that's really what I've done for 25 years. And so when we first launched into these healthcare kind of school professionals, we would ask them about interviewing, like, oh, do you interview? Have you ever had training in interviewing? And their answer is no. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, we don't interview kids. I'm like, well, really? They're like, no, And so I'm gonna look at Dr. Light here, and I'm gonna tease her for just a moment. And so when I talk to healthcare professionals, they're like, we don't interview kids, we history take. And I'm like, oh, so you collect information. How do you do that? You talk to them, but you don't ask, but you're not interviewing. They're like, no, we're just history taking. I'm like, oh, have you ever had training in history taking? They're like, yes, in medical school. There was a lecture in medical school. And I'm like, likewise, when you talk to school counselors, you're like, oh, do you conduct interviews with children? Nope, we talk to them. I'm like, oh, how do you talk to them? So it's, so first off, I've been humbled because now I have to switch my language, right? And so I need to talk to them not about interviewing. I need to talk to them about, well, how do you history take from children and adolescents? How do you collect information from them in a way that ensures that what they're telling you is complete, that they're comfortable disclosing? And it turns out we actually know an enormous amount about how to do that. And that's from this other field of child forensic interviewing. We have protocols in place. We know how to talk to reluctant children. We're developing strategies for talking to adolescents, which actually are different than the strategies to talk to children. But what we did find out in our surveys is that healthcare professionals and school professionals know very little about this separate field, despite this other field having direct implications for how these professionals might interact with high-risk youth to obtain valuable information. And because these healthcare and school professionals actually have that type of potential for a better relationship and kind of youth being more forthcoming, these strategies may actually be more effective with healthcare and school professionals than they are with law enforcement and social services. So what do we know then about interviewing CSEC from this forensic side? Well, we know a couple of things. So again, I like surveys. I like asking people what they're doing, because then I can sit in my little ivory tower and just stand up here and talk about what other people are doing. So we've actually done some surveys. We actually talked to law enforcement across the country, and we ask them about what types of challenges, what are their experiences when they encounter suspected CSEC. And so, their answers to what they say they do are really interesting, but we thought, that's not enough. Let's go actually look at what they actually do in those interviews. So we've done both of these types of projects, and I just want to highlight a couple of key findings that really kind of can help us direct how we should be training other professionals. Okay, so in our survey results, when we looked at how often they encounter some of these challenges, we asked them about the challenges they face when they encounter suspected CSEC. And actually, these challenges aren't unique to CSEC, I should say. They're pretty consistent when you look at challenges associated with interviewing adolescents who are victims of other potential forms of violence. So when you look at what these law enforcement say, they say, distrust of authority and evasiveness. Those are the most common or frequently encountered types of challenges. And again, thinking back just to adolescent development, even before you overlay all of the risk factors that come with high-risk youth, potential youth who have been victimized. That makes sense, right? When we asked them, well, how do you overcome the challenges? You see really clear, consistent patterns. 52% say, well, it's about the relationship, right? And again, I'm not preaching to the choir here. What I'm trying to argue is that this choir needs to actually get out there and preach to others. So 52% talk about relationship building. 38% talk about attending to their safety, their basic needs. And then kind of 10% talk about reinforcing that the minor's a victim. And I'm not arguing, like that last one always strikes me as interesting, but again, this is what they're saying, and this is what they're doing out in the field, or at least they're claiming they're doing. And so whether that's a good idea or not is a separate issue than that's something that they're reporting that they're doing. Okay, so then that was great. Here's what they say they're doing. Well, what are they actually doing? And so we've actually been incredibly fortunate to be able to partner with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This takes an enormous amount of trust between universities and government agencies, which I cannot tell you how long and hard we worked on this. But they've been actually giving us their interviews, a subset of a specific team within Homeland Security that does a lot of these interviews. They've been giving them to us to analyze and to look for patterns so that they can improve. Right? There's an idea. People being comfortable enough with their efforts to say, hey, we think we're doing an okay job, but do you have any thoughts? So what we've been able to do is they had some interviewers who one would argue are highly trained and others who were kind of new, just coming on board. And so what we were able to do with these interviews is we've actually been going in and coding them. And when I say we, I'm going to do a shout out to a couple of my team members back there, Kate Utzman and Gabriel Alvarez, who are both an undergraduate and a graduate student in my lab who have been doing amazing with some of these tapes. And I can't thank them enough. And so if you have any questions, ask them because they are immersed in this every day. We've been coding the tapes for the types of tactics the interviewers are using to try to elicit information, for how much rapport building, because again, everybody's saying that's important, and then kind of how responsive victims are. So just a couple of quick findings. Number one, our trained interviewers are spending about 20%, almost a fourth of the interview on rapport, before they're even talking about substantive, kind of the target topic. And the CSEC, the suspected victims know exactly why they're there. So it's not like you have to sort of casually be like, so, do you know why you're here? They know why they're there. But there's this relationship building component that's happening at first, far more often with the trained interviewers. And this is working. The trained interviewers are asking open-ended questions. They're eliciting lengthier responses. And then in addition, they're less the untrained interviewers are getting these more sassy and evasive responses. And people always wonder what those are. Anybody who's talked to an adolescent knows what these are. It's things like, so, who were you with last night? People. Tell me about those people. People I know. Right? So that's what we're talking about, evasive. They're answering without being helpful. It's a hallmark characteristic of adolescents, especially these adolescents, and especially if interviewers are untrained and don't know what they're doing. All right. So that's kind of this idea of interview characteristics. But when we actually talk to these highly trained interviewers, they stress that it's so much more than just rapport, it's so much more than just the questions. It's really, these trained interviewers are talking about are the victims comfortable and safe? And one of the things I think that I've learned over the years is, in talking to different kind of interviewers across the countries, some of them talk about they don't even interview a kid. And then you're like, what? If you talk to, how are we going to collect evidence? They're like, you let them sleep. So they bring them in, you don't even interview them. You let them sleep. Get them some food. It used to be hot Cheetos. Apparently now it's Takis, because I am transitioning to being cool. So my daughters would disagree. However, I will claim, so get them some food. Let them just sleep. And then in addition, they talk about, and one of the things they really talk about with our interviews is they talk about just addressing health needs. STD testing, pregnancy testing. Are they having trouble sleeping? Just some of the basic health needs. So not even talking to them about victimizations or even suspected victimizations, but really just assessing and addressing their needs first. In addition, they also talk about the importance of having plans in place. And this in some ways goes back to the healthcare survey, where you can't put this burden on professionals without making sure that there are plans in place. Likewise, you can't interview victims, find out they've been, or suspected victims, find out they've been victimized without having a plan in place. It is absolutely paramount. And these interviewers who are highly trained know that, and they really work hard to kind of address all of these characteristics in addition to questioning the victim when they can. Okay, so take-home message number 2, law enforcement, like other professionals, need continuing training on rapport building, on questioning approaches, and addressing victims' broader needs that kind of both in, but also extending beyond the interview. And if we can address these needs, if you really think about it, if we want to improve identification of youth at risk for exploitation, we have to be cognizant. We have to be aware of what puts them at risk in the first place. We have to make sure that we also know once we identify at-risk youth, we have to know how to respond. And kind of many of you have this knowledge, if not most of you, but what we really need to do is to kind of really expand that knowledge, and we need to make sure that all professionals who are interfacing with vulnerable youth have that same knowledge, have the skills to respond, and then have the action plans in place so that once they do respond, if vulnerable youth are identified, that they have adequate resources, support, and kind of a plan to help those youth further. Sorry, that was my soapbox. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there. Ooh, 25 minutes. I just was perfect. So anyway, I was allowed 25 minutes, so thank you all so much.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Lenora Burney. I'm a psychologist with the Healthcare Agency. I've actually been a psychologist for about 23 years, but if you read my bio, I was actually a teacher before that. My understanding is that most of you guys are working in the education field. Maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're a nurse in the school, maybe you're just within the personnel within the school system. And if you saw my bio, you also saw that I got my teacher's credential at USC. So I did my student teaching in the neighboring schools in the area. And if you know about USC, it's like the heart of South Central. So it's some pretty rough schools. But back then, kind of like the doctor was saying, I wasn't given any training about trauma-informed care. Nothing about human trafficking or CSAC or anything. So probably now that I think back, there was a lot of high-risk behaviors that I wasn't informed of. Some of my students probably were being exploited back then, but I didn't know about any of that stuff. And I have to be honest, I was young back then, and a lot of my students felt very comfortable talking to me, and they were telling me some really horrific stories. And I was like frozen in my tracks. I didn't know what to say to them. When they would share some of their stories, I was just felt like I needed something profound to say, something spectacular, something really life-changing. And I really felt like I needed some extra tools. I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide. I needed something to really set them on their path. And I felt like I needed more training. So I went back to school. I felt maybe I could get a master's in counseling or something. And so I went back and I got some counseling training. I liked it so much, actually, that I went back and went into psychology. I didn't go back and continue teaching. But that's why we're here today. We're going to give you guys some tools because I felt like I needed some extra help. I don't know that if you guys feel that way, but I know I felt a little helpless. And I'm hoping that today we can give you some practical day-to-day things that you can say so that you can feel also empowered. So that if you come across some students who you think perhaps are in the life or in the gang, that you can say something that you can feel like you're being supportive. Because I know in your role, you guys have a very diversified job. You guys are doing multiple tasks throughout the day. You're very stressed out. Teachers' jobs are never done. I was an English teacher, and I remember I was always grading papers, reading stuff late at night. On the weekends, I spent all my time reading journals and stuff like that. So I'm hoping that today we can make your life a little bit easier. I'm not ready for this slide yet, sorry. But most importantly, what I hope that you leave here today is that you're not as afraid as I was. Because I remember when I was in the classroom, I was just like, oh my gosh, I would go home and tell my roommates, I don't know what to say to this kid today. This kid put some heavy stuff on me. And so hopefully that you'll just relax, kind of like how this saying goes, just be calm. What you need to do is just, you're not a social worker, you're not a probation officer, you're not an investigator, you're their support system. And so what you need to do, they've chosen you to someone they trust that they can, share something with. And so you just need to, be there to be their listener, their support person. Okay, next slide, please. So this conference is about ensuring justice. And so I thought it would be important that you can't really talk about justice if you don't talk about bias, because the opposite of justice, injustice, bias. And as much as we all hate to talk about it, we all have bias, whether we admit it or not, whether it's conscious or not. There's bias everywhere. There's bias in the environment, in society, in schools, and yes, even in the classroom. So teachers, we have bias about different students. You might not like that student who appears to be the lazy one, who's sitting in the classroom, laying their head on the table, maybe even sleeping. Perhaps it's that tardy student, the one who's always strolling in late, maybe coming just a few minutes after the bell, maybe coming at the last, at the end of class. Maybe it's that kid who's always absent. Maybe it's that defiant student who kind of seems uncooperative, who even seems aggressive. I remember I was a petite teacher back then. Some of those students were way bigger than me, and I even felt like they were aggressive, like maybe gonna, you know, I don't know. I was afraid of some of them, to be honest with you. Some of them are disruptive. You know, they're talking, they're interrupting, they're on their phone the whole time. Perhaps you find that they're lying, they're deceptive. But some of these things, like, you know, they learn it in the life. Maybe they don't have the same upbringing that maybe you're accustomed to. The non-participating student, the one that's not motivated, who doesn't seem to care, the one who just never turns in any homework. So perhaps, you know, we need to kind of check ourselves as teachers, because lots of times it's natural to want to take things personal, to get defensive. And, you know, maybe that student that comes in late, instead of saying something negative and being frustrated with them, let's challenge ourselves to say something positive and to examine some of these behaviors. Perhaps it's because of they're being exploited. Perhaps it's because they're part of they're living the life. They're in the game. Maybe they're being exploited last night. Maybe they're being forced to work. Maybe they're being forced to be on substances. Maybe that's why they're being tardy and they're so tired, because who knows what they were doing the night before. Maybe they don't have reliable transportation. Maybe their caregiver doesn't have clothing. Maybe they don't have food in the morning. Maybe they had to take care of their siblings. I remember as an English teacher, here I am trying to force, you know, getting frustrated that they didn't do their vocabulary. Like, why didn't you do your spelling last night? And they were telling me, like, well, I had to babysit my kids, my siblings, or my parents were fighting, and I had to, like, cook for my sister last night. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, like, you know, it didn't even cross my mind that they were having these type of struggles, because when I was in school, you know, I was from an intact family. That wasn't my issue. My problem was, you know, what kind of prom dress I'm going to buy this year, you know, like that wasn't, you know, a struggle that I had to focus on. So again, I challenge you to think about, you know, maybe it's something different. So be positive. When they're coming into the room, instead of saying, oh, I'm glad you made it, or, you know, oh, you finally turned in some homework this time, you know, maybe smile and say, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you made it. It's good to see you today. Because, you know, they're used to being dismissed. Maybe they're used to being invisible. Maybe they're thinking that people just don't care about them. Maybe they're not giving that love at home. So, you know, say something nice to them. Maybe it's the only smile they're given that day. Maybe it's the only person who sees them as being someone who matters. What other things can you do? Next slide, please. And, you know, if you want to take a picture, you're good. But my understanding that these slides are uploaded into the conference app. So later on, you can, like, download this yourself, and you can have the entire presentation made available to you. So these are some things, some quick pointers or suggestions that you can have for later. But validate their feelings. What does that mean? Just recognize and accept their emotions. Give them some affirmations. These are things that you probably do with your friends anyway, but do it with, you know, so it's, like I said before, it doesn't have to be anything spectacular, anything magical like I thought I needed to do when I was a teacher. Just active listening. And what does that mean? Listening with purpose, letting them know that you're attending to them. That's just like nodding, smiling, good eye contact, not interrupting, not trying to give advice. You know, lots of times we feel like when someone tells us something, it could be a cultural thing, it could be, you know, that we feel like we need to say something. Oh, you should do this, or have you thought about that? You know, just listen. You don't have to tell them, you know, what, they don't need to be told what to do. They just want someone to hear sometimes. Display empathy. Acknowledge the pain and emotion that they might be going through. Provide resources. And my next slide will have those resources, so, you know, I'll give those to you. Reflect their feelings. Be non-judgmental. And then if they do share something with you, thank them for that. It's not easy to share. Maybe you're the first person that they decided to share something with. So let them know that you appreciate, you know, their trust. That you let them know that, you know, I knew this was hard to say, and that, you know, it takes a lot of courage and strength to come forward and say this to me. So thank them for that, you know, because, you know, it's not easy to open up to someone. And then if they do say something, let them know, you know, that, you know, maybe I'm not trained to do this, but there's someone in the district. There's people who are trained to deal with matters like this. This is kind of concerning to me, but we have a therapist. There's a counselor in the school district. Let me walk you over there. It's one thing to let them know that there's services, but it's quite another to do that warm handoff. You may not be able to leave the classroom right then, so that's okay, but if you are able, it's much nicer to be able to walk with them to the counselor and say, you know what, I'll walk with you. Let's go together. Let me introduce you to the counselor. I'll even sit there with you, and we can sit there together, and I'll support you while you talk to the person. If they want you to, maybe they don't want you to be there. Or if you can't do it then, say, you know what, I have a free period, third period. You want to come back, I'll walk over there with you. Because sometimes you can tell them, oh, there's the psychologist is in later today, and you tell them where to go. They may never make it. So if you can walk over there with them, that's even better. Things that you don't want to do, sometimes the motherly instinct that we have, we want to kind of touch their shoulder or put our hands on their back, rub their shoulder or something. And I've seen people, good intentions, like a social worker or teacher, even attorney sometimes doing that. And perhaps it's okay, maybe they have that relationships, but I don't know that. Sometimes, even in the courtroom, I see someone doing that, I'm kind of cringing, ooh, I hope that's okay. I don't know they have that relationship with that kid. And perhaps they're triggering that youth because lots of times these kids who are exploited, they're touched when they don't want to be touched. So I would, I discourage you from doing that or ask permission. You know what? Would it be okay if I put my hand on your shoulder or give you a hug right now? Ask permission for that. Don't just assume that. For some people it's comforting for you to put your arm around their shoulder, but for a lot of these kids, they don't want to be touched. And you might kind of send them into a spiral. Don't ask a lot of questions because that can be seen as imposing. If they say something that seems kind of upsetting, don't frown because that can be seen as judgmental. Refrain from asking a lot of why questions like, oh, why did that happen? Or, why did you do that? Because again, that can be seen as judgmental. So those are some things, again, that you can do and what not to do. Next slide, please. These are the resources right here that you should have maybe up in your classroom. If you're a nurse, you can have it in the nurse's office. If you go traveling, you might notice in the bathroom stalls, sometimes they have them there because it's good to have. Some students may never ask you for their resources. They might be embarrassed or ashamed or, just not ready to ask. So you can have them available for them or just up on your wall in your classroom. And they can take a picture of it with their phone. Or they can, they go into your nurse's office, they can take a picture of it there. And so it's good to have. And some of them are just websites or phone numbers or text, because kids nowadays, they prefer texting over calling anyway. So the texting one is really good. So these are some great resources I recommend that you have it readily available. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just wanted to leave you with some sentence frames. I know we're running out of time, so I'm not going to really go over each of them, but just some starter sentences. I know lots of times people want some very simple sentences, how do you begin that sentence? So again, when you're talking to youth, just paraphrase what they're saying, which is basically summarizing. So it sounds to me like, you felt upset or you felt disappointed or unsafe or, so basically just kind of paraphrase what they're saying. Reflect their feelings. So it seems as if you were frustrated right then or, clarify too. Make sure you understand what they're saying. It's basically checking for understanding. Empathize with them. I'm sorry that happened to you. It sounds really awful that you had to go through that. Or, that just really sucks. It's okay. You can just say things like that. Just make sure that, because they want to feel understood. That's really what they want. They want someone who understands them. And then lastly, just, you can just ask them, how can I help you? Maybe there's nothing you can do. Maybe they're not ready for you to help. They're not asking for your help, and that's okay. But you can just let them know that you are there, and that you're wanting to help, but they might not want your help right then. And so that's all for now. The last slide is just a thank you slide. So thank you for listening. Alyssa is going to go a little bit more into depth about the help you can give.
Thank you, Dr. Burney. I'm running very cold and I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to stay grounded for my portion of the presentation. My name is Alyssa Vergara. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. The vast majority of my clientele actually do come from Grace Court. They're referred over to me. I specialize in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, sexual trauma, as well as commercial and sexual exploitation. I prepared a handout for reference of this presentation called the Stages of Youth with CSEC. Stages of Change with CSEC Youth. And I believe it's available through the app and with the online conference materials if you wanted to take a look at it. So the first thing to note when you're dealing with a victim of commercial and sexual exploitation is that a lot of the times the very word victim, that terminology, can be triggering and counterproductive when you're trying to encourage a youth to leave the life. The youth who are referred to me for therapy a lot of the times don't perceive their relationships with their exploiters to be exploitation. And because of that, I do use a lot of what Dr. Searle mentioned earlier, motivational interviewing when it comes to treating this population. Not just because substance use is one of the key, if not like, it can be the primary and sometimes risk factors that leading up to exploitation, but also because just like any other person going through issues of codependency or recovery, they may not yet be ready for change. So for those of you who don't know, motivational interviewing is a modality that we use primarily to treat people with substance use disorders, and it involves acknowledging and honoring where the person is at in treatment, being non-judgmental, using a lot of reflective listening and emotional validation like Dr. Burney just exemplified for us, and then also recognizing the difference between where a person is in their life and where they would rather be, or calling attention to that. So with motivational interviewing, or MI as we call it, we typically also use what's known as the Stages of Change model, and that's what the handout is about. I created the handout to show what it looks like specific to this population, and it has kind of what it looks like and what to do. Just a general framework so you guys can have it for reference. And a lot of the times the youth who are referred to me are in the first two stages. That's pre-contemplation and contemplation. So with pre-contemplation, the youth doesn't even see that there's a problem yet. And with contemplation, they're only beginning to entertain it. And I've got to be honest with you guys, when it comes to this population, even if you've got a big interdisciplinary team and loads of resources and you might be throwing everything at the youth, it can still take years to move through those stages of change and to get to what we call the maintenance stage, where the youth has left the life and at least is not intending to go back. So I'm not going to belabor the presentation by going over each of the stages of change in depth. That's what the handout is for, and it would take too much time. But aside from the first two stages, there's also preparation, where the youth is beginning to plan to make the change. There's action, where they're taking the steps, and then there's maintenance, where this is the point where we typically see some therapeutic progress or progress with their personal goals. They're identifying new ways to grow, and they're continually distancing themselves from old settings, old behaviors, what have you. So you're probably asking what you, or even collectively what we might do to help somebody on their journey. When a youth is suspected or identified as CSEC, and they're exhibiting a lot of those problem behaviors that lead to teacher bias that Dr. Burney was talking about, like the dishonesty, the truancy, emotional dysregulation, self-harm, threatening other people, they're disregarding their education, their responsibilities, and even their personal safety. It's exactly what she said. You have to model the opposite. You have to keep calm. Ask them what it is that they're needing, what are they reacting to, and how can you help? And then once you've established that rapport and you've made a connection with the kid, it's also important to lay down the ground rules for interaction with the youth, because consistency is important. I hear a lot of times from my clients that they said this and then they did that. They acted this way, more considerate and understanding one day, and then the next day they were like cracking down. So you need to be there for them and then remind them of what the school or agency administrator can and won't tolerate, because we all have our policies and protocols, but still be trauma informed too. You have to keep that door open. Tell them that you understand that they're upset. They wouldn't be acting this way if there wasn't something wrong, and that whenever they're ready to talk, you'll be there for them. And if the youth is in outright distress, or it doesn't even have to be outright distress, if they're expressing any ambivalence at all about an exploitation situation that they might be in, that's when I recommend that you echo and honor their concerns. You pay attention to their language, you paraphrase and reflect the words back to them. So I'll give you a quick example of a conversation I had with a youth that happened to be in a school setting, but it could have been anywhere. She was talking to me about how her boyfriend had asked her to do something that she wasn't comfortable with. It was something that was leading up to sex work. I could see like the escalation, like the grooming kind of going on there. And there would have been fallout for her on the streets, and she had used the word safety. So I told her, it sounds like you don't want to do that because it's unsafe. And she said, yeah, it might lead to X, Y, Z, and I don't feel safe. And then I said, well, it also sounds like you don't feel like this boyfriend, like he's respecting your boundaries. We had already gone over boundaries at this point. And she said, yeah, he's not. So I said, well, I agree with you. It's not okay that you're made out to feel unsafe, and that's not what a boyfriend should or ought to do. And notice at no point did I call him out for being an exploiter, even though we both knew that the situation was pretty sus. And that's just because she and I only known each other for a few weeks. She was still very much codependent on this guy. He was her primary support. And the idea of him being her abuser wasn't something that she was yet psychologically ready for. And if you introduce that terminology and the education too early when it comes to the stages of change with CSEC youth, they're teenagers, they're going to double down, they're going to run right back into their arms. So just a word of caution in that respect. So it doesn't matter, though, because she was already beginning to realize this on her own, right? So what did I do? I talked to her about boundaries, because that's just something that I think everybody can grasp onto. It's very reasonable psychoeducation, it's neutral, and that way we had a frame of reference to begin to build in the rest of the psychoeducation piece, and it encouraged her to develop that discrepancy. So in summary, I just wanted to let you guys know, please don't assume that they're ready for change. We're all mandated reporters. If they tell us that they've got a adult boyfriend or a street mom or a relative who's effectively pimping them out, we're going to have to make a call, and then ideally there'd be a change, right? But the problem is that the world is full of exploiters. There's always another one waiting in the wings. So the real way out, the only way out is through. They've got to make the change themselves, and you're just part of helping them get there. If this life is normal, if it's what they've grown up with, or if it's what they've chosen in lieu of whatever hell is going on at home, just honor where they're at.
So we have 15 minutes for questions. And I have a question. So it's so good. We get like 3 professional practitioners for 2. Because your teaching experience, how does your experience as a clinical psychologist now, working with our kids in our CSEC court, how does that frame your interaction with teachers when you go out to do trainings? I'm hoping you're fulfilling her number 2 assignment. So how does because you're training from a clinical psychology perspective, teachers, because we want teachers. We heard earlier 500,000 children in Orange County. They're not all going to see researchers or clinical psychologists. They're going to see a teacher. So how does that help you with having that background of being a teacher?
Well, I know the day-to-day struggles of a teacher and how stressful it is. So it helps in the fact that I know what their life is like. And so I know, like I was saying earlier, they're multitasking, and so how stressful it is. And so it helps me to see their perspective and how frustrating it could be and all the things that's going through their head. And this is like one more thing and how scary it could be, like I was saying earlier, and like, oh, one more thing I have to deal with. And so just kind of like being empathetic with their frustrations.
You tried. Okay, so this is something I keep hearing. Teachers don't have room for one more thing. So your homework assignment, Dr. Quas, is going to be difficult. And I've done training with school nurses, and I'll have to tell you, and I know we have school nurses in the room, I was not at a school. I was shopping, and a school nurse who had been in a training saw me, turned the other way. Then she came back, and she literally put her hand out and looked away and said, I know what you told me, but I'm covering 3 schools. I don't have time. And so I think we have some challenges that we're facing in that respect. Do you have any ideas about how we can overcome that? I think it's part of the solution. And maybe this question, Dr. Quas, you can give us some insight. Do you think that your studies on what stakeholder organizations are doing and identifying should be replicated in religious organizations? Do we need to reach outside the school system?
So that's a great question. So, we've done a couple of surveys. We, surveyed healthcare, we surveyed schools. And if you think about meeting youth where they're at, youth are in religious institutions. There are youth who are going to people in their church, going to others. And so I think it is worth really thinking about broad-based education. And, and again, if we really want to be really smart, it's athletic coaches, it's after-school program. I think we can really think about this in a broad way of just educating the public about the realities of what victimization might look like. And so, we focus, it doesn't have to be a 6-week training for everyone. It'd be great, but that's never going to happen. But at least if you have some posters up in the bus station, it would be nice if those posters were highlighting some of the vulnerabilities of what victims may actually be like, rather than, again, the chained woman, which I don't know if anyone's seen a chained woman, but and so I think even minor kind of tweaks in our public awareness campaigns could be beneficial. In terms of piling something onto teachers' plate, one of the things I think Ruthie, look at I'm calling out Ruthie, was talking about is, teachers right now have enormous kind of training requirements. They have to do, socio-emotional learning, I think, in lots of places. And some of the things that you were talking about, active listening, kind of meeting youth where they're at, we don't need to develop a whole new program for trafficking. And so when some people talk to me like, we need training in trafficking, I'm like, you need training in sort of, self-awareness, self-confidence, empowerment. I think Joe Baldo had these 4 E's, and I forgot what they were, but what I just remember empowerment. Because some of the training that we're already doing can help if you just sort of add it. And so what I would love not to do is to create a whole training just for trafficking, because the same youth who are at risk for trafficking are at risk for lots of other outcomes. Healthy sexual relationships, healthy, romantic relationships. If you kind of know your boundaries, if you know kind of risk factors, if you know kind of the consequences of different forms of exploitation, you can kind of build in some of those in really small ways, and again, potentially have a huge impact. you'd want to measure it, but it doesn't mean we have to develop an entirely new separate training program, because the same skills that are in one domain can help you in another. Unless I'm wrong. She'll tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I was just going to say that in addition to not just training the teacher too, like I think there's a lot of funding that's also happening in the schools right now where they're just providing mental health awareness to the teachers and the students. In fact, in my kids' school today, at their school district, they're having, it's called a day of dialogue, where the entire school, they have about 20 or 30 presenters coming to the school, and every period the classes are they're having a presenter, and they're like my daughter is reading off the different presentations. One is about, love shouldn't hurt. One is about, coming out. One's about fentanyl. And it was all about mental health awareness. And the teachers are going in with their classrooms, and they're having a day of dialogue, and they're going to have debriefings afterwards. And the entire day is about mental health awareness. And they do this several times throughout the year.
So the next question is for Alyssa, and actually there's like a barrage of questions for you, Alyssa. They want to know what terminology you recommend instead of victim for CSEC youth, and so is there a better word? Just real quickly.
It really does depend on the youth. I have some youth who use the term survivor, and I have some youth who don't even like that term. So I pay attention to what the kids tell me and how they like to reference themselves. So I'd say maybe a good 30% of my clientele like the word survivor, maybe about another 20% actually do like the word victim if they've got that kind of insight, because it puts the culpability on the perpetrator once they've reached that point, and that's fine. But some people don't like to even think that they've been victimized or that they've survived something. So they've kind of a lot of times I'll reference it. I'll just use the T word because I'm the therapist, so I'm allowed to. So that you've been through it, that you've had some trauma, because that's just specifically once they've had the psychoeducation in that respect, and that's usually one of the things that I lay down if they haven't already heard it. And unfortunately, a lot of the kids I work with have been through therapy, but because they've changed therapists or it hasn't been continuous, they might not have gotten the psychoeducation on trauma. They know about coping skills, they know about emotional disturbance to some degree, but they don't really know it at length. So once I provide that framework for them and it's trauma, then we can always refer back to the trauma. So we don't necessarily even need a label. You can have them tell you as they see it, and then try to reflect those words back to them.
So I'm going to combine two other questions for you, Alyssa. We want to understand how youth are engaging in sugar dating and also self-generated child abuse material. So how do you have those conversations?
Well, they're trying to get their needs met, right? So a lot of times with the sugar dating, they see themselves as effectively they're gaming. So they're out there, playing these older people in order to get the money. But then a lot of the times, at least it's not necessarily in the immediate aftermath, but it might be a couple of weeks later, all of the feelings of guilt and shame tend to creep in. A lot of times, too, when the youth are doing that, they might have substances, there might be an element of glamour because of the money that they're receiving for it. But at the end of the day, those are the cheap thrills or the things that are masking, the hurt. A lot of times they're recreating the trauma. So when the feelings of guilt or shame come in because they might have had previous sexual assault or sexual abuse, they might start not feeling so great once the glamour kind of wears off, and that's when they tend to talk to me about their misgivings, like their ambivalence and stuff like that. And that's when you can kind of start to get them to see, yeah, it might feel good in the moment, you might feel as though you have control and you're exercising control in the moment, but what's the end result? Do you end up feeling any better about yourself? And, a lot of times, I forgot the latter half of the question, but with the online, like the OnlyFans and stuff like that. A lot of times with that stuff too, they might, again, there's an element of control and they're getting their needs met with respect to money and someone's paying them attention. And sometimes that can feel really good. If they haven't had a consistent caregiver, to have someone who's older and who's stepping in and who's taking care of them. And, they feel like they've set everything up by, creating that profile or posting that material in the first place. A lot of it's power and control. But at the end of the day, they don't see necessarily how they're being gamed or how they're being played until, again, they have that sort of shame aftermath.
So is there a way for you to talk about the potential consequences?
Oh, yeah, I can definitely talk to them about the potential risks. And a lot of times, because I've had the benefit of doing this for about 3 years, I have a gazillion different anecdotes and stories about how it might look like this, and then it could eventually turn into that. And just to be mindful of, like in the beginning, you might feel as though, well, I'm just posting something. It's not necessarily going to lead to anything in person, but invariably it really does because things escalate pretty quickly.
Our time is up, but there's a few more questions. But this one, I'm not sure if anybody here can speak to this, but is there a way we could add some trafficking training into the credentialing programs to help teachers as they come into the job and are new, like you were, Dr. Burney? Anybody want to address that? No credentialing experts here. Well,
I don't know if you need to add it in as a formal course. I mean, what I'm hearing you both say is that there's a lot of these skills and talking about consequences of actions that can be built into other courses. I think, I always just think, if you look at credentialing programs, you look at teachers and you say, we're going to add something. I mean, it's like you can just see their heart rate go up. They are incredibly burdened. And so to the extent, I think if you can fold it in, you can fold into, graduate course, graduate training in education. I think there are ways of folding this in. That don't necessarily, look like they're adding a whole new course. So I'm sort of a fan of combining rather than adding.
Yeah, I don't know if it will be a requirement, but I mean, there's always like a multitude of different students you come across. Like I'm a huge advocate of like multiculturalism. So maybe you could squeeze it in there, like, in addition to, learning about multiculturalism and, different, races and, gender stuff, maybe even learning about different, other high-risk behaviors and high-risk students, perhaps.
so Dr. Quas, your next research assignment, we need you to assess required teacher training and see where we can add 5 minutes to at least 3 of them. And it also has to be fun because we remember more when it's fun than when it's just boring. So, okay. Give them a big hand.